Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Langston. I'm 32 years old, and I never imagined I would watch my own family collapse inside the mahogany-paneled library of our waterfront estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Just moments earlier, our longtime attorney had calmly announced that my parents had quietly transferred $78 million in inheritance assets. Money meant to be divided among all three of us, directly to my younger sister, Malene. I felt the air leave my lungs. Then something happened no one in that room was prepared for. My grandfather, Theodore Langston, the man everyone believed was frail, fading, barely lucid, pushed aside the blanket on his wheelchair and stood up slowly, steady. His eyes were clear, focused, sharp in a way I hadn't seen in over a year. And then he said 7 words that stopped my heart. "I know exactly what you've done." In that instant, I realized something far more terrifying than stolen money. My childhood had been built on a lie. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from the very people who were supposed to protect you, take a moment to like and subscribe. What happened in that library changed everything I thought I understood about loyalty, blood, and legacy. And trust me, karma arrived in a way none of us saw coming. To understand the weight of that day, you need to understand the Langston family. We weren't just wealthy. We were Greenwich legacy, multi-generational privilege, the kind of financial security that makes people speak your last name differently. My father, Christopher Langston, ruled our world like a polished strategist. Harvard MBA, calculated, always 5 steps ahead. My mother, Genevieve Langston, curated our family's image with surgical precision. Charity galas, country clubs, perfect Christmas cards. Then there were the 3 of us. Nathaniel, my younger brother, by 3 years, the creative one, forever resisting the corporate path laid out for him. Malene, the youngest at 26, adored, protected, polished, and me, the eldest, the reliable one. From the moment Malene was born, the balance in our house shifted. My baby photos were tucked into quiet albums upstairs. Hers were framed and displayed in the main hallway. My birthdays were backyard gatherings with a handful of classmates. Hers had pony rides, live performers, catered desserts. The favoritism wasn't subtle, it was architectural. Malene has your father's instinct. My mother used to say, even when my sister showed more interest in designer handbags than financial statements. Meanwhile, I was studying relentlessly, graduating from Wharton, determined to earn my place at Langston Development Group, the company my grandfather had built from a single rundown property into a $180 million real estate empire across New England. And through all of it, my grandfather was my refuge. While my parents attended Nathaniel's music showcases out of obligation and Malene's recital with visible pride, my grandfather sat front row at my debate competitions and business presentations. "You remind me of myself," he once told me as we walked along the shoreline behind our estate. "You want to build something, not just inherit it." His story was family legend. A single apartment building in the 1960s. Long nights, risk after risk. By the time he handed operational control to my father 15 years earlier, the company had become a regional powerhouse. I admired him more than anyone. Where my father maintained, my grandfather had created. He taught me that wealth wasn't about preserving comfort. It was about generating value where none existed before. But after I graduated, my parents' dismissal of my ambitions became harder to ignore. Despite my credentials, my father placed me in charge of a small rental division instead of the development role I had earned. "Property management will be good experience," he said patronizingly. "Development requires a certain instinct that can't be taught in school." The irony. Malene, who had barely scraped through her business degree at a state university, was handed a vice president title the moment she graduated. She was immediately given access to major development projects inside Langston Development Group, projects I'd spent years preparing myself for. The favoritism wasn't hidden anymore, it was policy. When I met Julian Mercer in my late 20s, he was the first person who saw it clearly. Julian was a high school English teacher, thoughtful, observant, grounded in a way my world had never allowed. He didn't come from old money, he came from honesty. After his 3rd dinner at our estate, he looked at me across the table and said quietly, "They're grooming Malene for something, and they're deliberately pushing you aside." At first, I defended my parents. I told him Malene just needed guidance, that maybe my father saw potential in her that I couldn't yet see. But deep down, I knew Julian was right. The question that haunted me wasn't whether it was happening. It was why. Why favor the youngest so openly when I had followed every rule, earned every credential, proved myself again and again? When Julian proposed, my parents' response was polite and cold. My mother hosted a small engagement dinner at the country club. Elegant, restrained, forgettable. Nothing like the lavish event I knew would have been arranged if Malene had become engaged to someone from a legacy family. "A teacher," my mother whispered to my father one evening, not realizing I was within earshot. She could have married into the Ashford family or the Winthrop line. Julian and I married anyway. We bought a modest colonial about 30 minutes from the Langston estate, far enough for space, close enough for expectations. I stayed at LDG, still trying to break through the invisible ceiling my parents had installed above me. Meanwhile, Malene floated from department to department, applauded for completing tasks I had mastered years earlier. Her smallest accomplishments were celebrated. Mine were treated as obligations. Nathaniel, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with real estate. Music was his world that both irritated and relieved my parents. Irritated because it defied their blueprint. Relieved because it meant he wasn't competing for control of the empire. That left the unspoken rivalry between Malene and me, except it was never a fair fight. Through all of it, my grandfather remained my anchor. He invited me to private lunches, asking sharp, pointed questions about development margins, zoning issues, long-term growth strategies. He listened, really listened, and would nod slowly when I outlined my vision. As I entered my 30s, I allowed myself a quiet hope. Maybe when the next leadership transition came, his influence would matter. Maybe merit would finally outweigh favoritism. What I didn't know was that something far more complicated was unfolding behind the scenes. Something that would expose a rot buried deep within the Langston fortune. About 2 years before everything shattered, my grandfather began to decline. At first, it was small things. Forgetting a name, misplacing his glasses, repeating a story he told an hour earlier. At 85, it didn't seem alarming, but by the following spring, the deterioration accelerated. He moved from his private wing of the estate into a medical suite outfitted with equipment. A full-time nurse was hired. Visits were scheduled, monitored. Despite my workload, I made time to see him at least twice a week. I'd bring fresh flowers and sit beside his bed, quietly updating him on the business, even when my parents insisted he couldn't follow complex discussions anymore. "He just finds comfort in your voice," my mother would say dismissively. "Don't burden him with business details, doctor." Halpern says stress could worsen his condition. And yet there were moments when I saw something different. When I mentioned Harbor Point residences or investor projections, his eyes would sharpen, focus return. He would ask precise strategic questions, the kind that required full awareness. Then just as quickly, he would retreat back into vagueness. When I brought it up to my father, he waved it off. "Sundowning," he said casually. "Temporary clarity common in dementia patients." But as my grandfather's supposed decline deepened, I began noticing changes elsewhere. Inside the company, departments were quietly reorganized. Longtime loyal executives were reassigned. New outsiders were brought in, something our family had rarely done. The restructuring wasn't discussed openly. It was executed, and for the first time I felt something colder than jealousy. I felt suspicion. When I raised questions during executive meetings about the sudden restructuring at Langston Development Group, I was given the same polished answer every time. "We're positioning the company for the future, and your grandfather approved these changes." That explanation was repeated so often it began to sound rehearsed. What unsettled me more were the closed-door meetings between my parents and Benjamin Keller, our longtime family attorney. On 3 separate occasions, I arrived at the estate to visit my grandfather, only to see Keller walking out of my father's study with thick folders tucked under his arm. When I asked my mother about it, she smiled. The tight social smile she used at charity galas. "Just estate planning, Allison. We're making sure everything transitions smoothly." Smoothly. Around that same time, Malene underwent what can only be described as a personality transplant. After years of treating her vice president title like an accessory, a corner office, and a company credit card, she suddenly began attending every board meeting. She took meticulous notes. She lingered with financial officers. She asked questions she'd never cared to ask before. The shift was abrupt, almost theatrical. "I've come to appreciate how important Grandpa's legacy really is," she told me one afternoon over lunch. Her tone syrupy with sincerity that felt rehearsed. "Dad's been mentoring me privately. He says I have a natural instinct for big picture strategy." Big picture, the words echoed in my head. I tried voicing my concerns to Nathaniel during one of his rare trips home from Los Angeles where he was still chasing a record deal. We sat on the terrace of my house in Greenwich, sharing a bottle of wine under the fading light. "Something isn't right," I told him. "Dad's making massive structural changes without full board consultation. Malene is acting like she's already in line for something, and they're limiting access to Grandpa." Nathaniel swirled his glass and shrugged. "You're overthinking it, Allison. Dad's always been controlling, and Malene's just trying to impress them like she always does. Grandpa's 85 and sick. It's sad, but it's not some elaborate conspiracy." I wanted to believe him, but the unease in my chest didn't fade, it intensified. The turning point came by accident. I had gone into my father's office looking for quarterly performance reports when I noticed a folder sitting open on his desk. The label read "Confidential Succession Planning." I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Inside were draft documents outlining the transfer of substantial assets from my grandfather's personal holdings directly to Malene. Not to the trust, not equally divided, directly to her, bypassing both Nathaniel and me entirely. Before I could process what I was seeing, my father's voice cut through the room. "What are you doing?" He crossed the office in 2 steps and yanked the folder from my hands. Those are private family matters, Allison. Private family matters that apparently don't involve me. I shot back, my voice shaking despite my effort to steady it. He didn't hesitate. Your grandfather and I have made decisions based on what's best for the future of this company, he said coldly. Not everyone has the temperament required to manage significant wealth. The implication was unmistakable. The conversation ended there, but something shifted permanently between us. From that day forward, I started documenting everything. Organizational changes, unusual financial transfers, the dates of Keller's visits, the growing distance between me and key projects I had was once led. Julian worried I was becoming obsessive. But my instincts have never failed me, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. The final Christmas before the will reading felt surreal. We gathered in the estate's grand dining room as we always did. My grandfather was wheeled downstairs for the traditional gift exchange. He appeared particularly foggy that evening, calling Malene by my name and struggling to recognize Nathaniel. On the surface, it was heartbreaking. But at one point, when everyone else was distracted with dessert and champagne, I glanced toward him and caught something I can't explain. He was watching my father, not with confusion, not with fragility, with calculation. That look stayed with me. As we were leaving that night, Malene pulled me aside with unusual warmth. She squeezed my arm, smiling softly. You should really think about your future outside of Langston Development, she said gently. You and Julian could move anywhere. With your degree, you'd thrive. Have you ever considered starting over somewhere completely different? It wasn't advice, it was a warning. They were preparing to remove me, and they expected me to step aside quietly. What none of them knew was that the reading of my grandfather's will would dismantle every careful plan they'd built behind closed doors. The morning of the reading arrived crisp and bright, the kind of early autumn day that normally would have filled me with calm. Instead, my chest felt tight. Julian reached over and squeezed my hand as we drove through the wrought iron gates of the Langston estate. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew what this day might mean. This could be the moment my exclusion became official. As we parked beside my father's black Bentley, Julian turned to me. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we still have each other and we've built a good life. That's something no one can take. The library had always been my favorite room in the house. 2 stories of leather-bound books, a massive stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake created an atmosphere of timeless elegance. Today, however, the room felt suffocating. My father stood near the stone fireplace in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, posture straight, expression controlled, like a CEO about to announce quarterly earnings instead of a son about to divide his father's legacy. My mother sat poised in a leather wingback chair, her blonde hair immaculate, her face arranged into a carefully curated expression of sorrow. Malene was dressed in black, understated but expensive, the kind of black that suggested mourning, even though my grandfather was still alive. And then I saw him, Theodore Langston, wheeled in by his nurse, slumped in a specialized chair, a plaid blanket draped over his knees. Despite the warmth of the room, his once commanding presence appeared diminished, almost fragile. For a moment, my chest tightened. He looked small, detached, as if he barely understood what was happening around him. Nathaniel arrived last, awkward in a suit that didn't quite fit his musician's frame. He hugged me quickly and chose a seat as far from our parents as possible. The physical distance said everything. At the head of the room, Benjamin Keller cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Thank you all for being here, he began in his calm, professional tone. Given Mr. Langston's current health, he has chosen to execute certain elements of his estate plan now rather than waiting. He believes this ensures a smoother transition and allows him to witness his wishes carried out during his lifetime. The words sounded rehearsed. Keller moved through the standard legal language. Charitable donations, executive appointments, tax considerations. I barely heard any of it. I was waiting for one thing, the company. Regarding Langston Development Group, Keller continued. Mr. Langston previously transferred operational control to Christopher. As you all know, ownership shares were to be distributed upon his passing as follows. 40% to Christopher, 20% to Allison, 20% to Nathaniel, and 20% to Malene. My heart lifted slightly at the word were. At least at one point my grandfather had intended fairness. But then Keller adjusted his glasses again. However, under a revised estate plan executed 3 months ago following the transfer of power of attorney to Christopher, a substantial redistribution has already occurred. The air shifted. Keller lifted a document from his leather portfolio. Mr. Langston has transferred $78 million in liquid assets and equity interests and key real estate holdings to Malene Langston. This includes Harbor Point Residences in Stamford, Hudson Crest Towers in White Plains, and the Monta Shoreline Villa. The room tilted. Harbor Point, Hudson Crest. Those were my projects, properties I had managed for 5 years, developments I had negotiated, analyzed, and built from foundation to framework. Harbor Point wasn't even complete yet. I had overseen the environmental impact studies, worked with zoning officials, designed a mixed-use community blending luxury and workforce housing. And now these assets, Keller continued, have been removed from the remaining estate distribution and are now solely owned by Malene Langston. Clear's throat. That's not possible, I heard myself say. My voice sounded distant, detached from my body. Those properties were explicitly designated in the original estate plan for equal distribution. My father stepped forward, expression carefully balanced between patience and authority. Allison, he said smoothly, your grandfather and I discussed this thoroughly. Malene has shown exceptional business growth this past year. And given that you and Julian both have stable careers and Nathaniel has chosen a different path, Malene simply has greater financial need at this stage. Greater financial need? Nathaniel repeated sharply, leaning forward for the first time. She lives in a company-paid penthouse and hasn't worked a day outside the position you handed her. Malene's cheeks flushed. That's not fair, she snapped. I've been working closely with Dad on major strategic initiatives. Just because I don't broadcast everything like Allison does doesn't mean I haven't earned this. Earned. The word hit me like a slap. I let out a short laugh, but there was nothing humorous in it. Malene, I said evenly. Last year, you couldn't explain a cap rate in a development review meeting, and now you've earned $7.8 million in assets. My mother's voice cut in sharply. Allison, this reaction is exactly what concerned your grandfather. This competitiveness, this inability to celebrate your sister's success. Success? I stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. What success? What has she actually accomplished besides being your favorite? Keller shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. No, I interrupted, stepping toward his desk. I want to see the transfer documents now. After a brief pause and a silent nod from my father, Benjamin Keller handed me the documents. The paper felt heavier than it should have. There it was in black and white. My father's signature acting under power of attorney authorizing the transfer of $78 million in assets. Assets originally intended to be divided among the three of us solely to Malene. The date stamped at the bottom made my stomach drop. It was signed during the period when my grandfather's decline had supposedly worsened. This is wrong, I said quietly, scanning the pages again, as if the words might rearrange themselves. Grandpa would never approve something like this. He believed in fairness. My father's response was smooth, almost rehearsed. People change their minds, Allison. It's because when they see who truly values the family legacy, and who may be distracted by outside interests, his eyes flicked toward Julian. The implication was clear. Years of work, years of loyalty, reduced to a hobby. Everything I had built inside Langston Development Group handed to a sister who hadn't shown genuine interest until recently. The injustice pressed against my ribs. I felt tears threaten and forced them back. I would not break in front of them, and then everything changed. From the corner of the room, I heard the faint rustle of fabric. My grandfather slowly pushed the blanket off his knees. The nurse stepped forward instinctively, but he lifted his hand and stopped her. With deliberate effort and astonishing steadiness, Theodore Langston stood up. The room froze. His voice when he spoke was stronger than I had heard in over a year. That's enough. My father went pale. Dad, you shouldn't be standing. Let's get you back to your suite. But my grandfather fixed him with a stare so sharp it silenced him mid-sentence. I've been watching you very carefully, he said evenly. And the will you just heard is a fabrication. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's hand flew to her pearl necklace, an old nervous habit. Malene looked as if she might faint. My father stood perfectly still, calculating, assessing. Keller cleared his throat cautiously. Langston, these are the documents you signed when I was supposedly incompetent, my grandfather interrupted, his voice gaining strength with every word. When I was declared incapable of making decisions for myself, he turned directly to my father. Christopher, did you really believe I wouldn't discover what you've been doing? My father opened his mouth. My grandfather raised a hand. Don't. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I have proof of everything, he continued calmly. The embezzlement, the falsified accounting, the offshore transfers, every transaction routed through shell entities in Grand Cayman and Luxembourg over the past decade. The room felt like it was collapsing and rebuilding all at once. Judge Raymond Brooks has a copy of this, my grandfather added. One call from me and it goes directly to federal investigators. The air shifted from family dispute to criminal exposure. My grandfather hadn't been fading. He had been observing, testing, and my parents had failed spectacularly. Chaos erupted. My mother burst into dramatic tears. My father stepped toward my grandfather, only to be halted by a look so fierce it stopped him mid-stride. Malene sat frozen, her composure shattered. Nathaniel moved beside me, without a word. Our shoulders touched a quiet alliance we hadn't shared in years. Everyone sit down, my grandfather commanded, and astonishingly they did. Even my father, the man who had ruled both our family and the company, sank into his chair like a reprimanded child. I'll start at the beginning, my grandfather said, moving with surprising steadiness to the head of the table, his rightful seat. 14 months ago, I began noticing discrepancies in our quarterly reports. Properties that should have been generating strong returns were underperforming. Development budgets were inflated. Funds were shifting through accounts in patterns that made no operational sense. He looked directly at my father. At first, I assumed poor judgment, but my old friend, Judge Brooks, who has spent decades presiding over financial crime cases, suggested something far more troubling. My father's complexion shifted from pale to ashen. Judge Brooks had been my grandfather's closest confidant for more than 50 years, and he was known for his expertise in financial crimes. Neither, it seemed, had my grandfather. Judge Brooks connected me with a forensic accountant and a private investigator. My grandfather continued, his voice steady now, controlled. What they uncovered was worse than I imagined. I couldn't confront him immediately. If I had, he would have erased every trace before we could build a prosecutable case. I needed documentation strong enough to survive federal scrutiny, not just family outrage. He turned directly toward my father. Christopher, you've been draining assets from Langston Development Group for at least 8 years. Millions rerouted through shell corporations and offshore accounts under fabricated identities. The words didn't echo. They landed. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. Whether from fear or calculation, I couldn't tell. Theodore, this is absurd. Christopher increased the company's valuation. The annual reports clearly reflect growth. The annual reports reflect what Christopher wanted them to reflect. My grandfather cut in sharply. The actual financial position tells a different story. We should be worth nearly double what appears on paper. He shifted his gaze to Benjamin Keller, whose discomfort was now unmistakable. Benjamin, I'm disappointed. You had to suspect those documents I signed weren't legitimate. Keller swallowed, Mr. Langston, I was informed that you were experiencing lucid intervals when significant decisions were executed, given your medical evaluations. My medical evaluations, my grandfather interrupted, one eyebrow lifting slightly, which were conveniently supported by specialists who later received substantial anonymous donations to their research foundations. Silence, the puzzle pieces in my head began snapping into place. Restricted access, new doctors, escalated narratives of decline. So, you were pretending? I asked quietly, struggling to reconcile the sharp strategist standing before me with the fragile man I had been visiting for months. He looked at me and his expression softened. Not entirely, Allison. I am 85. I do have memory lapses, but not to the degree they allowed everyone to believe. A faint smile crossed his face. I learned to appear more impaired when certain individuals were present. Then he turned back to my father. I needed to know how far you would go. Would you stop at manipulating financial statements, or would you attempt to rewrite my final wishes? The room was breathless. So I created a test, he continued. I accelerated the illusion of decline. I allowed you to believe you had control. My father straightened slightly, recovering fragments of his composure. Dad, this is an overreaction. I've made aggressive tax strategies, yes, but nothing illegal. And the adjustments to the estate plan were discussed. You agreed Malene showed potential. Stop. My grandfather's voice was quiet, but final. The performance is over. He reached for the flash drive again. My investigator has documented $31.4 million transferred into entities ultimately controlled by you and Genevieve. Not corporate accounts, not legitimate trusts, personal control. My pulse thundered in my ears. $31.4 million. He nodded to his nurse, who briefly exited the room and returned with a distinguished older man in a dark suit. This is Daniel Harper, my grandfather said. Former federal financial crime specialist. He has been assembling this case for nearly a year. Harper gave a small professional nod. We have transaction trails, encrypted communication records, and sworn statements from 3 former employees who were instructed to falsify documentation. The evidence is substantial. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was criminal exposure. Malene suddenly broke down. Not the carefully measured tears she used when she didn't get her way, but uncontrolled sobs that shook her entire frame. I didn't know, she cried, mascara streaking down her cheeks. I knew some of the paperwork felt strange, but Dad said it was standard tax optimization. My grandfather's expression hardened. You knew enough. Those documents you signed authorize into international transfers. Your signature appears on formation paperwork for shell corporations in Grand Cayman. She did what I instructed, my father snapped. Leave her out of this, just as you left Allison out. My grandfather replied evenly. The only one in this room who demonstrated both business judgment and integrity. The one you marginalized because she might notice discrepancies. The words hit something deep inside me. For years I had questioned myself, wondered if I had imagined the sidelining. Now it was spoken aloud. Julian's hands found mine under the table. My grandfather continued, the document you heard earlier is fraudulent. My legitimate estate plan remains intact, unchanged from the structure I established 5 years ago. Daniel Harper stepped forward with another folder. Langston Development Group will be placed into the Langston Legacy Trust, my grandfather declared. Allison will serve as primary trustee, Nathaniel as co-trustee. Major operational decisions will require joint approval. He let the silence settle. Christopher Genevieve, you are removed from all leadership positions, effective immediately. My parents stared in stunned silence. For the first time in my life, I saw my father without a script. His mind was working. I could see it calculating, searching for leverage, an escape hatch, some legal maneuver he could weaponize. You can't do this, he said finally, his voice tight but controlled. You legally transferred power of attorney to me. These revised documents won't survive judicial review. My grandfather gave him a thin, almost tired smile. Power of attorney obtained through deliberate misrepresentation of my mental capacity. He replied evenly. Judge Raymond Brooks has already reviewed the evidence, and the independent medical evaluation I underwent last week without your knowledge confirms I am fully competent to make these decisions. That landed harder than anything else. Then he turned toward Nathaniel and me. There's one more truth you deserve to hear, he said quietly, and it may be the most painful. He drew in a slow breath. Christopher's not my biological son. The words didn't echo, they detonated. If you're still listening to this story, I want you to pause for a second and imagine that moment, the foundation of your family history, cracking in real time. Have you ever discovered that the people you thought you knew weren't who you believed they were? Because in that instant, my entire understanding of the Langston legacy fractured. Silence swallowed the room. My father didn't clear his throat move. His face became unreadable. Not shock, not anger, just stillness. My mother looked down at her hands, studying her manicured nails like they might offer an exit. What are you saying? Nathaniel finally asked, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. My grandfather's expression held something deeper than anger. It held grief. Your grandmother, Margaret, and I were married 3 years without conceiving a child, he began. We were undergoing testing when she suddenly told me she was pregnant. I was overjoyed. I never questioned the timing. He paused, eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the library walls. It wasn't until after she died of cancer, when Christopher was 17, that I discovered her journals. She had a brief affair with my former business partner, Jonathan Whitaker. Christopher was the result. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I chose to remain silent, my grandfather continued. Christopher had already lost his mother. I had raised him, loved him. He was my son in every way that mattered. If you loved him so much, my mother snapped suddenly. Why humiliate him like this? Why expose something so deeply personal? My grandfather's gaze sharpened. Because Christopher has used preserving the Langston name as justification for manipulation, deception, and favoritism. He has wielded this family legacy like a weapon, rewarding compliance, punishing independence. He looked directly at my father. The truth is, you've never understood what the Langston legacy represents. You never built anything from nothing. You inherited control. My father finally spoke, his tone dangerously calm. So this is revenge. You publicly declare I'm illegitimate and strip me of the company I've managed for 15 years. This isn't revenge, my grandfather replied. It's accountability. He didn't hesitate. You and Genevieve will retain a combined 15% beneficial interest in the trust. You will receive income distributions, but you will hold no operational authority. My mother's voice cut in sharp. And Malene, she will retain 10% ownership, my grandfather said, and her current position for a probationary period. Her future within the company will depend entirely on her conduct moving forward. Malene wiped her face, eyes darting between our parents and our grandfather. This is outrageous, my father declared, rising abruptly. I will contest this. I'll challenge your competency in court. Please do, my grandfather replied calmly. And I will forward the complete investigative file to federal authorities. How do you imagine Harbor Point investors will respond when they learn capital was diverted to personal offshore accounts in Grand Cayman? The threat wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. For perhaps the first time in his life, my father had no countermove. We're leaving, my mother said, standing and gathering her purse with trembling hands. Malene, come. Malene hesitated. For a split second, she looked at me, then at my grandfather. Malene, my mother repeated, her tone edged with command. After a long pause, she followed them. The heavy library door closed behind the three of them with a sound that felt final, like the end of a chapter no one could rewrite. That evening's dinner was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. My grandfather insisted we remain at the estate to begin what he called the transition. My parents and Malene arrived late to the dining room, clearly having spent the afternoon in tense private discussion. The massive oak table, built to seat 24, now felt both cavernous and suffocating at the same time. There were only a handful of us left, yet the tension between us filled every inch of the room. We ate in near silence. The only sounds were silverware against porcelain and the occasional quiet request to pass the salt or the wine. Nathaniel kept glancing at me from across the table. His expression mirrored my own disbelief. After the plates were cleared, my grandfather set his napkin down carefully. Tomorrow morning, he said, we'll meet with the board to announce the leadership transition. Allison, I'd like you to prepare a brief statement outlining your vision for Langston Development Group. My father's knife clattered sharply against his dessert plate. This is premature, he said, barely masking his frustration. The board has worked with me for years. They won't simply accept Allison stepping in without resistance. They will, my grandfather replied evenly, when they understand the alternative is public scandal and potential criminal charges. He let that hang in the air. Most of them have capital invested in LDG. They'll choose stability over spectacle. That night, I retreated to the glass-ceiling gazebo, overlooking the gardens, to call Julian and try to process everything that had happened. Nathaniel joined me a few minutes later, sitting beside me on the cushioned bench. He leaned back, staring up at the stars. So, he said after a moment, I guess we're business partners now. Despite everything, I let out a small laugh. Apparently, he rubbed the back of his neck. You realize I don't know the first thing about commercial development. You know more than you think, I told him. And you understand people. That's half of leadership. He was quiet for a moment. Are you okay with this? I asked softly. You've always wanted your own path. He exhaled slowly. Honestly, I might be relieved. Music will always be my passion, but LA, it's brutal. Too much talent, too few doors. Maybe this is the universe nudging me somewhere else. I can still write, still play, but maybe I can also help fix what Dad broke. Co-rusties, I murmured. Checks and balances, he replied. Something our parents never believed in. The next morning, my grandfather summoned me to his private study, a room I hadn't been allowed to enter for months. Unlike the grand library, this space felt intimate. Worn leather chairs, shelves lined not with legal volumes, but family photographs. He unlocked an antique cabinet and pulled out a faded photo album I had never seen before. We sat side by side on the small sofas as he opened. Construction sites, ribbon cutings, grainy photographs of handshake deals in the early days of what would become Langston Development Group. Your grandmother, Margaret, was my heart, he said quietly, pointing to a photo of a young woman standing beside him in front of their first completed building. When I discovered her affair after she passed, it shattered me. Not just the betrayal, but the silence she left behind. Is that why things always felt strained between you and Dad? I asked, even before the financial mess. He nodded slowly. I tried not to let it influence how I treated him, but perhaps some part of me was always searching for Margaret's betrayal in his face. And Christopher, he always sensed something missing between us, even if he didn't know what. He turned another page. Photographs of my father as a young man graduating from college, stepping into the company. I should have told him when he was old enough to understand, my grandfather said softly. Secrets like this don't disappear. They fester. Like the secret about the embezzlement, I asked, unable to hide the edge in my voice. He met my eyes. Yes, though I suspect that particular betrayal had simpler motivations. Your father enjoys power, and your mother's family lost their wealth generations ago. Her status has always depended on the Langston name. He closed the album gently. There's something else you must understand, Allison. Christopher may not be my biological son, but he is my son in every way that matters. I raised him, taught him, loved him. His choices are his own responsibility. But the emotional distance between us, that part may be mine. The complexity of it all settled heavily on me. A secret kept out of love had quietly shaped decades of resentment. What happens now? I asked. He folded his hands together. Now we rebuild the company, yes, but more importantly, the family, or at least the parts that can still be saved. Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the study door. Nathaniel stepped inside, his tense. You need to come downstairs, he said urgently. What is it? Dad's in your office, he said, looking at our grandfather. He's shredding documents. The weeks after what our family would later call the revelation were some of the hardest of my life. My parents didn't retreat quietly. They declared war, legal war, emotional war. The day after my father was caught shredding documents in my grandfather's office. My parents moved out of the Langston estate and returned to their penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Within days, they retained one of New York's most aggressive corporate litigators. The message was clear. They weren't going down without a fight. My grandfather temporarily moved in with Julian and me while the legal dust settled. Our modest colonial in Greenwich suddenly felt too small for a man who had built a $180 million real estate empire, and yet strangely more alive with him there. We drank coffee at our kitchen table in the mornings. He told stories about his first construction loans, handshake deals, and the fear of losing everything in the early years. In those quiet moments, he felt less like a titan and more like a grandfather. My parents' first legal move was predictable. They filed a petition challenging my grandfather's mental competence, despite the independent medical evaluation that had already confirmed his capacity. They submitted affidavit from the very specialists they had previously installed, all claiming that he suffered from significant cognitive decline, punctuated by brief lucid intervals. It was strategic. If they could undermine his competency, they could undermine everything. The case was assigned to a judge known for her direct, no-nonsense approach to family disputes. She ordered a comprehensive court-appointed psychiatric evaluation. The conclusion: my grandfather had mild age-related memory lapses, but he was entirely competent. With that tactic defeated, my parents shifted strategy. Their attorney filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the restructuring of Langston Development Group, arguing that my father had been acting under valid power of attorney and that the leadership transition would cause irreparable harm to the company. Meanwhile, Malene launched her own campaign, not in court but online. Carefully worded posts began appearing across her social media accounts. Photos of her and my grandfather from years ago. Captions about protecting elders and family members blinded by greed. She never named me. She didn't have to. One night, I showed Julian her latest post, a nostalgic photo of her and Grandpa on the shoreline captioned, "Some people will sacrifice family for power. Staying strong for you, Grandpa." Julian set aside the stack of essays he'd been grading and read it silently. "She's positioning herself as the victim," he said quietly, "while your parents siphoned $31.4 million out of the company. The irony is almost impressive. The strain on our marriage was subtle but real. Julian had always been my anchor. But between emergency board meetings, legal briefings, and forensic audits, I came home exhausted and emotionally afraid. Late nights reviewing financial records replaced dinners together. The weight I carried followed me into every room, even into moments that used to feel safe. One night, after snapping at him over something trivial, a forgotten grocery item, I stopped mid-sentence. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I don't want to bring all of this into our home." He pulled me into his arms. "For better or worse," he said softly, "and this is the worst part. We'll get through it." Nathaniel surprisingly became one of my strongest allies. While I focused on restructuring operations and stabilizing development projects, he stepped into investor relations and marketing. His natural charisma, honed on small stages and open mics in Los Angeles, translated surprisingly well into reassuring nervous stakeholders. He moved back from LA and rented an apartment near the office, throwing himself into learning the business with a focus I'd never seen from him outside of music. "Turns out I'm not terrible at this corporate thing," he joked over lunch one day. "Explaining cap rates to investors isn't that different from convincing a club owner to book your band." But the courtroom battles intensified. The injunction to halt the restructuring was denied, but my parents escalated with a broader lawsuit, challenging the legitimacy of the Langston Legacy Trust itself. Every hearing felt like public surgery. Family secrets dissected in sterile courtrooms, court reporters typing every painful revelation into permanent record. The community's response was divided. Some long-standing business associates distanced themselves quietly, unwilling to be linked to scandal. Others, particularly those who had suffered under my father's aggressive tactics, seemed almost vindicated. Extended family fractured along predictable lines. My mother's relatives rallied behind her. My grandfather's few remaining relatives stood firmly with him. Holidays, once obligatory but tolerable, became battlegrounds of divided invitations and conspicuous absences. Through all of it, my grandfather carried himself with a composure that still amazes me. His snort's wife's affair had been exposed. His son's betrayal laid bare, a secret he had guarded for decades, dragged into open court. And yet no bitterness, no theatrics. When he testified, he did so calmly. When questioned, he answered directly. He refused to descend into the emotional chaos my parents seemed willing to weaponize. "The truth doesn't need anger," he told me one evening as we sat at my dining room table reviewing legal filings. "It only needs consistency." About 6 weeks into the proceedings, I was still at the office long after sunset when my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Attached was a photograph, a diary page, my mother's handwriting, unmistakable, dated nearly 25 years earlier. "Theodore questioned the Riverside Towers projections today. He senses irregularities, but doesn't understand how long Christopher has been adjusting projections. I convinced him it was a reporting error. He still trusts me, though not entirely. Christopher says we must accelerate the strategy. I'm not sure how far this will go." My pulse spiked. The message that followed was short. "There's more. Riverside Park near the 79th Street Boat Basin tomorrow 2 p.m. Come alone." Evidence like this could dismantle everything. Or it could be a trap. After consulting our attorneys and my grandfather, we agreed I would go, but not blindly. Nathaniel would remain nearby, out of sight. Our investigator would position himself with a clear vantage point. The next afternoon, wrapped in a wool coat against the sharp November wind, I sat on the designated bench overlooking the Hudson River. At precisely 200 p.m., someone approached, hood up, head down. They sat beside me. When the hood lowered, I stared in disbelief. It was Greta Vogel, my mother's personal assistant, a woman who had worked for our family for over 20 years. "I don't have much time," she said quietly, her accent thicker than usual, strained. "If your mother knew I was here, I'd be dismissed immediately." "Why?" I asked. She kept her eyes on the water. "I have respected your grandfather for many years. What your parents are doing, it is wrong. I have watched too long without speaking." From inside her bag, she handed me a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Your mother's diary," she whispered. 3 volumes spanning 25 years. She believes they are secure in her safe. I made duplicates long ago. She stood abruptly. I was never here. You never saw me. And before I could respond, she disappeared into the flow of pedestrians. The diaries were devastating. My mother had meticulously chronicled the evolution of the fraud. From minor accounting adjustments to elaborate offshore schemes, there were detailed notes about shell entities in Grand Cayman, falsified development projections, and strategic misrepresentations made to investors. It hadn't been impulsive, it had been methodical. Worse were the entries about us. Nathaniel was dismissed as unsuitable for serious business. I was described as too principled, just like Theodore and Malene, perfectly pliable. One entry read, "She'll sign whatever Christopher places in front of her as long as she receives attention and access." When our legal team introduced the diaries in court, the judge ordered forensic authentication. Once verified as genuine, they shattered my parents' defense. The evidence of deliberate long-term financial misconduct was overwhelming. But even as momentum shifted in our favor, another reality surfaced. Working alongside forensic accountants, we discovered that over $2 million had vanished entirely, routed through so many layered entities and cross-border transfers that tracing it became nearly impossible. The money hadn't simply been hidden. It had dissolved into the labyrinth of international banking. And for the first time, I understood something unsettling. Winning in court didn't mean everything could be restored. Some losses were permanent. After one especially brutal day, combing through financial records with forensic accountants, I walked through the front door emotionally drained. Julian was waiting, a bottle of Beau already open. Takeout from our favorite Italian place spread across the table. "You need one evening," he said firmly, taking my briefcase from my hand and setting it aside. "Just one night without Langston drama." For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. We were halfway through dinner when my phone lit up, Nathaniel. I excused myself and answered. "Malene," he said, and something in his voice tightened my chest instantly. "Dad called me." I froze. "He wants to meet tomorrow. Just the two of us." "What did you say?" I asked, setting my wine glass down carefully. I told him I'd think about it. A pause. "I think I should go." Maybe he's ready to explain. Or apologize. Or divide us, I said quickly. That's always been their strategy. Separate, isolate, control. I know, he exhaled. But he's still our father, biological or not. Don't you want to understand why he did this? The question hit deeper than I expected. Did I want justice? Yes. Did I want consequences? Absolutely. But somewhere beneath the anger was a daughter who had once admired her father. A daughter who still wanted answers that could somehow make the betrayal coherent. "If you go," I said finally, "I'm going with you." The meeting never happened. The next morning, federal authorities notified us that my father had boarded a private jet in the middle of the night, bound for a country without an extradition treaty with the United States. He hadn't been seeking reconciliation. He had been planning escape. My mother claimed she knew nothing of his departure. Few believed her. The investigation into Langston Development Group shifted decisively from civil litigation into criminal territory. Federal agents began reviewing the full financial trail. And in the middle of that chaos, something unexpected happened. At what was supposed to be a routine doctor's appointment, I learned I was 8 weeks pregnant. Julian and I had been trying for almost a year. The timing felt impossibly ironic. New life emerging from the wreckage of an old one. When I told my grandfather, his eyes filled with tears. The first I had seen since the ordeal began. "Life moves forward," he said quietly, placing his hand over mine. "That's its grace." 1 year after the day he stood in the library and shattered every illusion, we gathered again at the estate, not for a will reading, not for litigation, for something quieter. The house felt different. We had removed the ostentatious decor my mother once curated so meticulously. Curtains were pulled back, rooms long closed off were opened. Light-filled spaces that had felt shadowed for years. My father remained overseas, reportedly living in a secluded villa funded by assets no one had yet located. The FBI had frozen what they could, but we all suspected he had prepared for flight long before the revelation. My mother had negotiated a plea arrangement, cooperating with investigators in exchange for avoiding prison. She now lived in a modest apartment in Bumbanest, far from charity galas and social columns. Malene's transformation had been the most surprising. After initially aligning herself with our parents, the reality of her legal exposure, the documents she had signed, the transfers she had authorized forced a reckoning. I didn't understand what I was signing. She had told me through tears months earlier. Dad said it was aggressive tax strategy. Everyone does it. You're old enough to know what you were signing. I told her gently but firmly. At some point, you have to own your decisions. That conversation marked the beginning of something fragile but real. She entered therapy, moved out of the luxury apartment, accepted a legitimate role within the company's charitable foundation. Work that for the first time seemed to genuinely engage her. Now, a year later, we sat together at the long dining table. My grandfather at the head, Nathaniel to my right, Malene across from me, Julian beside me, and next to my chair in a small bassinet, my 3-month-old son, Jacob, sleeping peacefully. His steady breathing felt like a quiet promise that cycles can be broken. After dessert, my grandfather folded his hands. "I've made a decision about this house," he said. We all looked up. "I'm selling Lakeview Manor." The words land without warning. Silence. Malene was the first to speak. "But Size, this is the family home," she said softly. "It's been in the Langston family for 3 generations." "Exactly," my grandfather replied with a calm nod. "And it carries 3 generations of secrecy, pride, and quiet resentment. This house shaped all of us, and not always in healthy ways." His gaze moved around the table, resting on each of us in turn. "The Langston legacy isn't this estate. It isn't even the company. It's what we choose to build next. And I believe we need new ground." Then, as if he had been waiting for this moment, he slid a portfolio across the table. Architectural plans. 3 adjacent homes on a stretch of land across the lake facing the estate, but from the opposite shore. "One for me," he said, "one for Allison and Julian, and one for Nathaniel." Nathaniel blinked. He had recently become engaged to a brilliant environmental attorney he met through our sustainable housing initiatives. Someone grounded, sharp, and refreshingly unafraid of family dynamics. Malene stared at the blueprints. "There are only 3, she said quietly. "What about me?" My grandfather regarded her thoughtfully. "That depends on you. Your probationary period with the foundation concludes next month. The reports I've received suggest you found genuine purpose there." He leaned forward slightly. "If you continue on this path with integrity, we'll build a 4th home, or you may decide your future lies elsewhere. The choice is yours." Malene's eyes filled. "I'd like to stay," she whispered. "I want to be close to Jacob. I want to be a real aunt, not the kind who sends expensive gifts and never shows up." Something softened in the room. Under Nathaniel's and my joint leadership, Langston Development Group stabilized faster than most expected. Transparency became our strategy. We met directly with investors, disclosed what had happened, and outlined reforms designed to prevent anything like it from ever occurring again. We downsized where necessary, sold properties tied too closely to painful memories, refocused on community-centered development, the kind my grandfather originally believed in. Nathaniel found unexpected fulfillment in his corporate role. He still played jazz on weekends, but he also spoke fluently now about sustainable financing and long-term asset planning. Julian reduced his teaching schedule to spend more time with Jacob and with me, anchoring our home while I navigated transition after transition. And somewhere in the middle of the crisis, I discovered parts of myself I hadn't known existed. Strength under pressure, clarity in chaos, the ability to lead not from ego, but from responsibility. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the water, my grandfather and I stood on the terrace watching gold and crimson light ripple across the lake. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked quietly. Telling the truth, exposing everything. He rested his hands against the stone railing. "In the short term, silence is easier," he said thoughtfully. "But secrets don't fade, they spread. Your father's dishonesty grew from the soil of my own silence. Your mother's manipulation thrived in shadows we allowed to exist." He shook his head gently. "No, truth is always worth the cost." He glanced back toward the house where Julian was showing Nathaniel how to properly support Jacob's head. "Look what emerged from the wreckage," he said softly. "Something real, something built on honesty instead of image." The following spring, we broke ground on the new properties. No press, no spectacle, just the 5 of us, and Jacob now crawling enthusiastically through freshly turned soil. My grandfather insisted each of us take a shovel, even Jacob. I guided my son's tiny hands around the handle of a miniature shovel as we turned the first layer of earth. "New foundations," my grandfather said, watching his great-grandson with quiet pride. "That's what matters." When I look back on everything, betrayal, exposure, accountability, rebuilding, I realize the most powerful moments weren't the courtroom victories. They were the moments of clarity. The decision to stop protecting appearances, the choice to build differently. 2 years later, the view from the opposite shore tells a different story. The 3 homes now stand where empty land once stretched toward the water. Clean lines, wide windows, spaces designed for light instead of legacy. My grandfather lives in the center house, stubbornly independent, still reviewing development proposals with the same sharp instinct that built the company in the first place. He walks slower now, but his mind hasn't dimmed. If anything, it's clearer, freed from the weight of secrets. Nathaniel surprised everyone most of all. He and his fiancée married in a quiet ceremony overlooking the lake, and he has become the steady public face of Langston Development Group. Investors trust him. Employees respect him. He still plays music on Friday nights at a small jazz club in Stamford, but now he plays because he wants to, not because he's running from something. Malene chose to stay. Her work with the foundation evolved into a full-scale community housing initiative focused on financial literacy for young women. It's the first thing I've ever seen her commit to without looking over her shoulder for approval. Our relationship isn't perfect, but it's honest, and that's new. As for my mother, she lives quietly now. The social columns no longer mention her. Occasionally, she sends a letter asking about Jacob. I respond cautiously, kindly. Boundaries are part of rebuilding, too. My father remains abroad. There are rumors, legal whispers, frozen accounts. But his absence no longer defines us. 3 years ago, our family fractured under the weight of truth. Today, we're smaller but stronger. Not because we avoided collapse, but because we rebuilt on something real. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you choose to protect. For years, I believed loyalty meant silence. That honoring your family meant defending their image at any cost. But silence doesn't preserve love. It protects dysfunction. And the longer truth stays buried, the more damage it does. I learned that integrity can feel lonely, especially when it puts you at odds with the people who raised you. But character isn't proven when life is comfortable. It's proven when doing the right thing costs you something. I also learned that justice and compassion can exist at the same time. Holding someone accountable doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means you refuse to let harm continue unchecked. Most of all, I realized that we are not bound by the mistakes of the generation before us. We can break patterns. We can rebuild differently. We can choose transparency over image, responsibility over entitlement, and truth over convenience. Family isn't defined by secrets or status. It's defined by what survives when the truth finally comes out. If this story moved you even a little, I'd truly love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when the truth changed everything in your family? Was it loud and dramatic or quiet and life-altering? Share your story in the comments below. I read more than you think, and your words might help someone else feel less alone. If you believe that integrity matters more than image, and that truth is worth fighting for, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this. And if you want to follow more real journeys of family conflict, justice, and rebuilding, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me through every revelation. Sometimes the end of one legacy is the beginning of a better